Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Aaron Esri. I am the Assistant Extension Specialist for Viticulture and Enology at Oklahoma State University. I'm recording this webinar today from my home office. So this might look a little different than any other webinars you may have seen, but I'm here at my house. Today we're going to talk about cold stabilization and winemaking. There is no audience present, it's just me, so this one might be rather quick. I'm just going to discuss what it is, how to do it, and I hope you can use it in your winemaking endeavors. So we will begin. So why do we cold stabilize wine? The big one is to enhance clarity, and also remove potassium bitartrates, which are those little wine diamonds, those crystals you find. We'll talk about that more in detail. Another reason to cold stabilize is to remove major lees. You can do it early on and drop a bunch of lees out of solution, especially in white wine making. We'll talk about that. Both red and white wines can be cold stabilized. White wines and rosés are almost always cold stabilized, whereas sometimes red wines are not, and that's totally a winemaker's choice. The idea is that whites and rosés are served cold. Therefore, you should cold stabilize during the winemaking process. Red wines are not necessarily served super cold. Therefore, there's no need for the wine to be that cold. So why cold stabilize it? I've met winemakers who do cold stabilize every single red wine they have. I've met others who don't. It's totally your choice. Anyway, we'll talk about what it is and then how to do it. So wine instability, like we just mentioned, the most common physical instability of bottled wine is the precipitation of potassium bitartrates. These are also known as wine diamonds or wine crystals. They look like tiny shards of glass at the bottom of a bottle or in the glass itself, but they are completely natural and they're totally harmless. What happens is that potassium in the wine will bind with tartaric acid in the wine, and this forms potassium bitartrate, and it with time and with cold temperatures, it drops out of solution. Um, they're totally natural and they're safe to drink. You can eat them if you know what they are. They really shouldn't bother you, but they really are unsightly and off-putting, especially to maybe a wine drinker who is not a connoisseur and they get served some tartrates in their wine. They might like, oh, this is horrible. Like, yeah, it's not the best looking thing in the world, but again, totally safe to consume. You can totally eat them. You can crunch on them. They're totally natural. Tartaric acid is natural in the grape. Potassium is natural in the grape, and the two together in wine will form this potassium bitartrate, wine diamonds, wine crystals. So we'll talk about how to drop those out of solution, and you do that via cold stabilization. And fun fact, tartrate crystals are the same thing as cream of tartar. So in your pantry, if you're a baker or something and you have some cream of tartar, same exact thing, potassium bitartrate. And this is what they look like. On the left is a glass of white wine, and the snowflake looking thing, the white mass at the bottom of the glass, those are potassium bitartrates. They were just poured out of the bottle into the glass. That's what they are. On the right, you see it's a red wine. Could be a rosé, but probably a red. You see it forming on the cork. So these potassium bitartrates formed on the cork just with time. And this is what happens when you don't cold stabilize a wine. So if you just make a wine, ferment it, clear it, rack it, filter it, bottle it, you do all those steps, but you never cold stabilize, you may end up with this. You probably will end up with this if you serve your wine cold, or if you just go months and months and months and years and years and years and years of aging it. They do form naturally with time. But cold temperatures will really precipitate them out very quick. So this is the consequence of not cold stabilizing, just FYI. Okay, so let's talk about them in detail. Potassium bitartrates. The chemical formula, KC4H5O6. It's potassium salt and tartaric acid. Well, it's a salt of potassium and tartaric acid. Like I say, potassium binds with tartaric acid and it forms potassium bitartrates. That's all it is. So too much tartaric acid in the wine has oversaturated it and it can't handle anymore. I mean, you can dissolve quite a bit of tartaric acid in a wine, but especially if you get it cold and alcohol is present and potassium is present, it's really easy for that to all precipitate out. So you just have an oversaturation of tartaric acid and potassium. So tartaric acid will begin to crystallize with potassium until the whole solution matrix is below saturation level. You see, so any excess tartaric acid and potassium will just start dropping out over time, especially with cold temperatures, until the wine solution matrix itself can handle the right amount. So cold temperatures is the best way to do this. Bentonite also helps this as well. But note that bentonite does not actually remove tartrates. What it does is bentonite will bind with proteins that may be harboring tartrates. So bentonite, which is a clarifier, more or less, well, it is. But bentonite binds with proteins. So there's manoproteins, there's cellulose, there's many different proteins in wine and juice for that matter. You use bentonite to clarify proteins out. Well, sometimes tartrates will harbor on the proteins. So you can actually use bentonite somewhat to rid tartrates, sort of, kind of, but cold temperatures is the best way to do it. Higher pH wines are more prone to tartrate instabilities. And this is because higher pH wines usually contain more potassium. So we always talk at harvest how you got to watch your pH, you got to watch your pH, you got to watch your pH, and you really do. You got to. I'm really not a fan of any wines above 4.0 pH. That's really too high. You run into a lot of issues. High potassium being one of them. And so when you have more potassium in your wine, you have a higher chance of forming these potassium bitartrates. You see, you need that. You need potassium and you need tartaric acid that forms potassium bitartrates. So higher pH wines are more prone to this instability. And if you're kind of a chemistry type, if you look at on the bottom of the slide, tartaric acid, the chemical formula for tartaric acid is C4H6O6. And so what happens is potassium, which is K plus, will kick off hydrogen, which is H plus, and that forms potassium bitartrate, salt. The one hydrogen gets replaced with the potassium, and it's that one potassium that binds with tartaric acid that will form that potassium bitartrate drop out of solution. So that's kind of the chemistry. It's not, huge in depth or really advanced. Well, some things in wine are because it's endless. You never know everything. But quickly speaking, potassium, tartaric acid, and then plus cold temperatures. That's how you cold stabilize. You just drop all this out of solution early on, and then try not to make it come back later, which we'll talk about. Okay, so more on these potassium bitartrates. Again, tartrate solubility in wine is reduced at lower temperatures. So that's why they precipitate out. They can't, the wine matrix cannot handle lots of tartaric acid at colder temperatures. So that's why you get the wine down to freezing more or less, and everything just drops out. Cold stabilizing a wine just above its freezing point is a common way to do this. Now, the freezing point of wine does change depending on the alcohol percentage. So let's say you have a wine with 10% alcohol. The freezing point of that wine is 25 Fahrenheit. If you have 12% alcohol wine, the freezing point is 23. And then if you have 14% alcohol, the freezing point is 21 Fahrenheit. So the more alcohol is present, the colder, or the lower your freezing point is, the more or less colder you'll have to get it. 30 Fahrenheit is about right. If you just want a quick answer, what temperature do I want to cold stabilize my wine? 30, 32, somewhere in there. And I think we'll talk about this in the next slide. Yep. So how to cold stabilize your wine? It's like, okay, just tell me how to do it. You just get your tank cold. That's how you do it. You cold stabilize with cold temperatures. You need to get that wine to about 30 Fahrenheit for about 2 weeks or so and hold it constantly. So a common way to do this is glycol jackets wrapped around a tank. If you have a wine tank that has a built-in glycol jacket, you just open up the glycol valves, pump cold glycol through there. It'll chill that tank down to 30 Fahrenheit. You just let it sit there for weeks, 2, 3, even if you want. You'll see a little thick layer of ice forming on the tank that you'll know it's working. And then all that potassium bitartrate just starts binding and dropping out of solution. And then you have to rack off, which I'll tell you about that too. If you don't have a glycol jackets, you're like, I just have tanks, I have no glycol. You can just use natural cold weather. It's at your discretion, but maybe you do live somewhere that's kind of colder, especially in winters. It hits, right around 32 for a few weeks. You can just roll your tanks outside during cold snaps. If you do this, don't put them in sunlight. I would say keep them in the shade, but I've heard of winemakers just rolling their tank outside for about a week, or two if the temperature persists. You can also just choose to open up the doors of your cellar if you want and allow the cold air in. Now do that at your own discretion because you got a lot of expensive equipment in there, and I'm not saying freeze out your whole cellar, but if you think there's nothing in there you're going to run, just leave your cellar doors open and let the cold air come in. And when I say cold air, I mean freezing air. It's got to be around 30 Fahrenheit. Carboys and small batches can actually just be placed in a fridge for weeks. A fridge is not quite 30, but it's still cold, and so you can get some cold stabilization out of just putting your carboys in fridge. If you, we're talking literally a gallon, so that's how you do it. You just need cold temperatures. You need to get that wine as cold not as possible. You don't want to go to like 0 Fahrenheit, but you do need to hold it consistently about 30 Fahrenheit for 2 or 3 weeks. And that is how you cold stabilize wine. And here are some glycol jackets. So these are tanks. Make sure to, miss a slide. Okay. These are tanks with built-in glycol jackets. I'm sure you've seen them at some point. Maybe you own a few. But those dimples, that dimple jacket around, that's actually what glycol will run through to chill your tank down. So these are just tanks that have built-in glycol jackets, and you can order them with, you can order them without. If you have a glycol system, why not do order built-in jackets? But so you need, if you don't have built-in jackets, you can purchase an external glycol jacket. So there are companies out there that make glycol cooling jackets that you can add on, you can retrofit them. So maybe you have like a little 50 gallon, 30 gallon tank on the left. You can buy just a glycol wrap it all around it. Maybe you have, a bin like that. I think that's a 230 gallon or a 230 liter, I forget. But you have a cube there. You can wrap a jacket around that. They make jackets for that. And then that looks like a 55 gallon drum that somebody was fermenting in. They make jackets for that. So there are jackets you can purchase to retrofit your tanks for. Now with this though, you will need a glycol system. And if you notice the picture on the right, you'll see that glycol chiller. That is essentially a generator for glycol cooling liquid that flows through. That is the glycol. We'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. Yeah, here they are, glycol chillers. So this is actually what you need to push glycol all through your cellar, all through your chilling tanks, your jackets, whatever you have. You just rig them up in a series or however you want. But you need a chiller. So it's essentially sort of kind of like an AC unit, if that helps you think on it a little more. I think it does have an evaporator. I think it does have a condenser. Don't quote me on that, but I think it does. And then it just pumps and cools glycol. Like that's the liquid that it uses to chill the tank. They range anywhere from $800 on the low end to about $15,000 on the moderate end. So they only get more expensive from there too. But it all depends on your system. If you only have a couple tanks, you can get away with $1,000 unit. If you have a very large operation, you're probably going to buy a really big unit to do this. But you just find what you need. They make varying horsepowers, anything from a 1/3 horsepower to a lot horsepower. And then you just rig up, you need this chiller, and then you need hoses and a jacket, and you just kind of rig it all up. And I think I have a diagram. Here it is. So this is a glycol chilling diagram. Let's say this is a winery somewhere, and we have our glycol chiller on the bottom left. We have our fermentation tanks just above it. And if you're just a smaller operation, you can actually just cut it off there. You can just get a glycol chiller, run it to the tanks, run it back, and you don't need to mess with anything else. But let's say you're a large operation, you say, I got 50 tanks and I got a barrel room, and I want to also heat the tanks up immediately after chilling them because I got stuff to do. It's like, okay, you can make it as elaborate as you want. So if you're a larger winery, you can buy a huge glycol chiller and run hoses all through your winery. You can run them to holding tanks, fermentation tanks. I mean, anything you want, barrel rooms, if you wanted to cool an entire barrel room. And they also make things called a heat exchanger. So these tanks do literally get freezing cold. They will heat back up with time, but that takes days, days, days. Um, they make a heat exchanger to where you say, okay, it's chilled. I've cold stabilized. I've racked my wine off while it was cold because that's important. I need to put something else in this tank. The heat exchanger will heat it back up, quickly. But again, that's only like huge operations. Um, so cold stabilization post fermentation. I keep mentioning you have to rack, and I hope everyone catches that because we'll talk about it now. So all wines can be cold stabilized. You can cold stabilize every single wine. Red, white, rosé, fortified, if you wanted. Um, but whites and rosés especially, because those are served cold. People always put them in a bucket of ice. Well, guess what? If you've never got your wine as cold as a bucket of ice, it will throw tartrates. You see, that's the whole reason. So you cold stabilize it before you bottle it, post fermentation, pre-bottling. You get it that cold before you bottle it, so that way when it does go into a bottle and when someone does serve it cold, it's not going to throw tartrates. That's why you do it. Again, some winemakers choose to forego red because they say it's never going to be served that cold. So why do it? Totally your discretion. Now, what's important, you get the wine tank cold for weeks at 30 Fahrenheit. Once it's held for 2 or 3 weeks at 30 Fahrenheit, it's cold stable now, barring a test, but it's cold stable more or less. You have to then rack off of the chilled tank into a fresh vessel while that wine is still cold. Because if you let that tank heat back up, all those tartrates you just dropped out of solution will start dissolving and saturating the wine again. So remember I said that it's less the wine will hold less potassium bitartrate at lower temperatures. It's less soluble at lower temperatures. If that wine heats back up and you didn't rack, let's say I got the tank cold and I held it there for 2 weeks, okay, and then okay, it's cold stable. I'll just turn off the glycol chiller and let it warm back up. You're going nowhere because all those tartrates you just dropped out are still at the bottom of the tank, and they're just going to dissolve and go back into solution if your wine hits 65, 70 degrees now. You see, you have to rack. You have to chill the tank to 30 Fahrenheit for 2 weeks, rack while that tank is still 30 degrees Fahrenheit into a fresh vessel that can be sitting at 70. That's okay. But the wine must be cold while you rack. You have to rack that wine off of those tartrates. And then now this wine is cold stable, that it's in a new vessel. So do not let the chilling tank warm back up with wine still in it. You're just going to solubilize everything you dropped out. Does that make sense? Because when you do rack out of a cold tank, you're going to see all those tartrates are going to be caked to the bottom, to the sides, and now you got to clean it. And that's a whole nother issue. Hot pressure washer. That's what you need. Um, but just know you have to rack after 2 weeks, still at that cold temperature. Rack into a fresh vessel. Now I have this fresh vessel of cold stable wine. And you can let it warm back up then because it's in a fresh vessel, free of tartrates. You are now have a cold stable wine. So that's important, and that's how you do it post-fermentation. Now, let's talk about cold stabilization pre-fermentation. And I'm hesitant to call it cold stable pre-fermentation because it can still, I mean, yes, it's cold stable now, but fermentation will mess with stuff, and you're going to make an acid addition later. If you make an acid addition after you cold stabilize, you kind of have to re-cold stabilize. But what we're doing pre-fermentation is we're dropping out a lot of gross lees early. And this is especially good for white and rosé winemaking. So we all know that white and rosé wine is made with juice, right? We don't ferment on the skins with white and rosés. We don't have must. We have just juice. So we've pressed and we have a tank of juice now. What you can do is take this tank of juice and chill it to about 35, 40 Fahrenheit because it doesn't have alcohol in it. You don't freeze it, but get it to 30, 40 Fahrenheit for 24, 48 hours. before you ferment, and that's going to drop a lot of lees out of solution. You then rack off, always rack when it's cold. You'll then rack off a gross lees, and now you have a very clean, delicate white juice that you can ferment and make something really nice. You see, so when you cold stabilize, I'm going to say quote unquote, because you still probably should cold stabilize after you ferment still. But if you do this technique pre-fermentation, you now have some really good, clean juice that's going to make a phenomenal wine. And the pros of doing this is that it's extremely fine white winemaking. There's less chance of volatile sulfur compounds forming during fermentation because you've just dropped a lot of just gross lees, you've dropped a lot of gunk, you've dropped a lot of proteins, you've dropped a lot of potassium out of solution before fermentation. And then you retain much more delicate aromas this way. You're really just fermenting a really nice, clean white juice or rosé juice, and it's going to turn out wonderful because you've already taken care of it so good before fermentation. The con to doing this is that it takes time because now you're 2 days behind. Well, I say behind schedule. If you know you're going to do the schedule for it, but it does take more time. It takes an additional day or two to really cold chill it and rack off a gross lees. And then you also need extra vessels because you always have to go into something. You see, you have to chill it down, drop everything out of solution that sits on the bottom of the tank, and then you have to rack. You have to take that clean juice off of everything you just dropped out. So you need an extra vessel and you need a few more days time. But I do think this technique is nice, and it's really it's good. Okay, other ways to stabilize wine. You can do something called contact seeding. This involves directly adding cream of tartar powder into the wine, cream of tartar powder into the wine. As I mentioned, cream of tartar is the same exact thing as potassium metabital. Oh, excuse me, I can't speak. Cream of tartar is the same thing as potassium bitartrates. So if you actually dose some cream of tartar into your wine, you promote the formation of bitartrates that are already present. You see, it's kind of like a jump start. There's potassium bitartrates in solution because it's not cold stable yet. Well, if I dose in some cream of tartar, I'm really oversaturating the wine now with cream of tartar with potassium bitartrates, but it will promote, at least that's the thought and the hope, and it does work. But you promote the formation of more tartrates. You know, it's kind of like fighting fire with fire, I guess, because it'll enhance the formation of potassium bitartrates by seeding. That's called nucleation. That's just a scientific term, I guess. Nucleation is the formation of a new phase using a pre-existing phase. So there is potassium bitartrates floating in solution. I add cream of tartar, which is the same exact thing, and it makes it like all come together in one big mass, and it'll drop out. So that's the idea. You have to continuously stir and mix though. So you have to pump over your tank for at least 2 hours, maybe longer. You can't just pour cream of tartar into your tank and then it just sink to the bottom. Like that's what'll happen. You actually have to mix it. You have to, stir it somehow. I mean, I guess you can hand stir it, but that's going to get real old. So just do a pump over for about 2 hours, and then things will drop out of solution. Another way called electrodialysis. I've never done this, but I guess it is another way to do it. It just uses ion exchange, ion membranes. You have anions and cations, and one will just bind with the other and drop out of solution. So that's electrodialysis. Okay, testing for cold stability. So once you go through all this, you cold chill, you cold stabilize your wine, you chill your tank down for 2 weeks, 30 Fahrenheit, you rack off, and now you have a cold stable juice or cold stable wine. You then need to test it to make sure it actually is cold stable. So one way to do that is called a cold test. You just get about 50 milliliters of cold stabilized wine and you put it in a freezer for a few days, or maybe one day, but 2 is probably better. If you see no tartrates, you're cold stable. And there should also be no haze. If you see it ever so slight haze, you're not quite entirely cold stable, but that's for you to judge, But the quick answer is if you see no bitartrate formation, you're cold stable. Remember when I said you can put a carboy in a fridge? Well, the fridge isn't quite 30 Fahrenheit, you see. So you got it almost cold enough, but not quite cold enough. So you do a cold test, you take a small sample, throw it in the freezer, And then if you see no haze at all, you are cold stable. You can't get any better. If you see a slight haze, you could have got it a little colder, but it's not the end of the world. It's up to you. If you want to try to re-cold stabilize it, by all means. If you don't want to, that's you're the winemaker. Do what you want. Um, so that's a cold test. And then a freeze thaw test is kind of the same thing. You take a wine sample, put it in the freezer, take it out, thaw it, see if any crystals form. If it does not show any crystals, you're cold stable. So the idea is that you're dropping all of those crystals out, those wine diamonds, the potassium bitartrates, you're dropping all of that out of solution via cold stabilization. You then take a small sample, throw it in the freezer, look at it a few days later. If you see no tartrates or no haze, you are cold stabilized, and you can put it in a bottle, put it in a fridge, and never worry about it throwing tartrates because you've already taken care of that. So that's cold stabilization and testing for cold stabilization. And that brings us to the end. So thank you so much for watching. I wish you the best of luck in all your winemaking endeavors, and I hope you learned something and apply it. If you ever need me, there's my email and my office phone. Reach out to me anytime. I'll be happy to talk to you. Till next time, thank you.